Imagine this. It's a warm night in Northern California. The kind of quiet, peaceful evening where the only sounds are the crickets and the distant hum of cars along an empty highway. A young couple sits in a parked car, laughing softly, their headlights off. They don't know that in a few seconds everything will change. From the darkness behind them, a car slowly approaches. Its engine cuts, silence. Then, footsteps. A beam of light flashes through their window. A voice, calm and steady, says nothing. And then, gunshots. Dozens of rounds echo across the still night. The killer walks back to his car. No panic, no rush, just composure. Minutes later, the phone at the local police station rings. A quiet voice speaks. "I want to report a double murder. If you go 1 mile east on Columbus Parkway, you'll find kids in a brown car. They were shot with a 9mm Luger. I also killed those kids last year." And then, the line goes dead. That was the moment America met the Zodiac killer. He wasn't like other killers. He didn't hide in the shadows. He was the shadow. He killed, and then he wrote about it, in taunting letters sent to newspapers, mocking the police, laughing at the public, daring them to stop him. He turned his murders into riddles, his identity into a puzzle, and his crimes into one of the most chilling games in criminal history. He didn't just want to kill people. He wanted to control them through fear. For years, he terrorized California with his cryptic symbols. It was a quiet Friday morning in August 1969 when a single envelope arrived at the offices of 3 California newspapers, the San Francisco Chronicle, San Francisco Examiner, and Vallejo Times-Herald. There was no return address, no clear sender, only a simple handwritten message on the front, to the editor. Inside was a letter unlike anything the editors had ever seen. Neat handwriting filled the page. Each sentence carried an unnerving calm, as if written by someone who enjoyed what he was describing. The letter began, "This is the Zodiac speaking." Those 5 words would mark the beginning of one of America's darkest mysteries, a case that would haunt police, journalists, and ordinary people for decades to come. The writer claimed responsibility for a string of recent murders across Northern California, killings that had baffled police for months. But this wasn't a confession. It was a challenge. Attached to each letter was a cipher, a coded message made up of symbols, circles, and strange hieroglyphs. The killer demanded that the newspapers publish these ciphers on their front pages. Otherwise, he threatened, more people would die. The editors stared at the symbols in silence. They looked like the writings of a madman, but there was something methodical about them. Each symbol placed carefully, each threat written with chilling confidence. The letters were sent to 3 different papers, as if the killer wanted the entire region to read his words at once. He wasn't hiding in the shadows anymore. He wanted attention. He wanted fame. He wanted to play. To understand the horror of what those words meant, you have to go back a few months to the peaceful suburbs of Northern California, where it all began. December 20th, 1968. On a lonely stretch of Lake Herman Road, a teenage couple, Betty Lou Jensen and David Faraday, were parked in their car, enjoying the winter night. They never made it home. When police found them, David was lying outside the car, shot in the head at close range. Betty Lou's body was found nearby. She tried to run. 10 bullets had been fired. 9 hit their target. The police called it a senseless killing. There was no robbery, no sexual assault, no apparent motive. Just execution. 6 months later, in July 1969, another young couple, Darlene Ferrin and Mike Mago, sat parked at Blue Rock Springs Park, barely a few miles away from the first crime scene. Suddenly, a car pulled up behind them. The driver stepped out, holding a flashlight and a gun. He fired 9 shots into the car. Mike survived barely. Darlene didn't. The next morning, police received a call from a calm male voice. The man said he wanted to report a double murder and then added chillingly, "I also killed those kids last year." He gave details only the killer could know. The voice was flat. No panic, no emotion. That was the moment investigators realized they were dealing with something different, not just a murderer, but a man who was playing a game. And now in August, the letters made everything official. The writer took credit for both shootings, describing them in detail, even mocking the survivors. The tone was cold, confident, not the frantic rambling of a lunatic, but the composed voice of someone who believed he was untouchable. The Vallejo Times-Herald hesitated to publish the cipher, fearing it might cause panic. But the killer's threat was clear. Within days, all three newspapers printed the strange symbols on their front pages. Readers were fascinated and terrified. Some saw it as a puzzle. Others saw it as the voice of a serial killer taunting an entire state. Everyone wanted to know what the cipher meant. Within a week, a schoolteacher named Donald Hardin and his wife Betty, sitting at their kitchen table, decided to take on the challenge. Using logic and intuition, they began decoding the 408-character message. Piece by piece, symbol by symbol, they cracked the message. When they finally finished, they stared at the paper in shock. "I like killing people because it is so much fun. It is more fun than killing wild game in the forest. Man is the most dangerous animal of all." The cipher didn't reveal his name. It didn't lead police to him. It was only a confession of enjoyment, a manifesto of madness. The Zodiac wasn't killing for revenge or money or power. He was killing for pleasure, and he wanted the world to watch. By the end of that summer, fear had taken hold of California. Every unsolved murder, every strange sound in the night, every anonymous call. People wondered if it was him. The Zodiac killer had made himself immortal through fear. He didn't just kill people, he turned their deaths into messages. Each letter, each cipher, each call was part of his design, a design that only he could understand. And as the first wave of panic swept through the Bay Area, police knew one thing for sure. The man behind those letters wasn't finished yet. He had only just begun to speak. It began as many tragedies do with innocence. December 20th, 1968, Lake Herman Road, California. The air was cold that night. A thin fog drifted through the countryside, covering the narrow two-lane road in a quiet stillness. It was the kind of evening where the only sounds were the hum of crickets and the soft rustle of oak trees swaying in the winter wind. For Betty Lou Jensen, 16, and David Faraday, 17, it was supposed to be a simple night out. They had just left a friend's Christmas concert, laughing and teasing each other, talking about plans for the holidays. Betty Lou wore a bright red coat. David had borrowed his father's car, a 1961 Rambler station wagon. They weren't supposed to be out late. Just a quick drive through the countryside. A little time alone before heading home. But at 11 p.m., their world and a piece of a small American town would shatter forever. At around 11:10 p.m., a passing driver named Stella Borjas noticed a car parked awkwardly near the entrance of a remote gravel turnout on Lake Herman Road. It looked like any other parked vehicle at first. But something felt off. The headlights were off, the engine wasn't running, and as she got closer, her stomach sank. There were two figures on the ground. David was lying beside the driver's side door, motionless. Betty Lou was farther away, face down in the grass, as if she had tried to run. Stella sped off in terror, racing toward the nearest police station. When officers arrived, the scene was surreal. Betty Lou was already gone, shot 5 times in the back as she tried to escape. Her body lay 15 feet from the car. Shell casings littered the ground, 9 of them. Each one carefully placed, suggesting control, not chaos. There were no signs of robbery, no signs of sexual assault. No struggle. Whoever had killed them had done it quickly, efficiently, and without hesitation. In the days that followed, the quiet town of Benicia was consumed by fear. Parents forbade their children from going out at night. Newspapers called it a double murder with no motive. The sheriff's office was flooded with tips, but none made sense. Witnesses reported seeing a light-colored car near the scene that night. Some mentioned hearing gunshots. Others claimed to have seen two cars parked side by side. It was chaos, fragments of truth buried beneath panic and rumor. Investigators struggled to understand the why. There was no evidence of a robbery. Nothing was stolen. The keys were still in the ignition. It felt random. Too random. But in hindsight, the details painted a much darker picture. The killer had parked his car deliberately behind the Rambler, blocking its exit. He had approached the couple silently, maybe with a flashlight in one hand and a gun in the other. David likely got out first, trying to reason with the man. He was shot point blank in the head. Betty Lou ran, terrified, but she didn't make it far. The killer fired again and again, hitting her 5 times before calmly returning to his car and driving away into the darkness. No witnesses, no fingerprints, no motive. Just 2 young lives erased in seconds. At the time, police treated the case as a tragic but isolated event. Teenagers killed in a lover's lane, perhaps a jealous ex-boyfriend or a drifter passing through. No one could imagine that this was just the beginning, the first chapter in a nightmare that would haunt California for years. In the months that followed, the investigation stalled. Leads went nowhere. The evidence, minimal, almost surgical, provided no clue about the killer's identity. But he was watching. He was reading the headlines. And he wasn't done. 6 months later, on July 4, 1969, the pattern would repeat itself. Another couple, another quiet night, another isolated lover's lane. Only this time, the killer wasn't content with silence. He called the police himself, calmly, casually, as if reporting a traffic accident. "I want to report a double murder. If you go 1 mile east on Columbus Parkway, you will find kids in a brown car. They were shot with a 9mm Luger. I also killed those kids last year. It was the same weapon, the same precision, the same method." The Zodiac had returned, and now he wanted credit. What began as a small-town tragedy was becoming something far larger and far more terrifying. The killer was organized, intelligent, and meticulous. He planned his crimes, selected his victims, and left just enough behind to taunt investigators. But what made him truly dangerous wasn't his gun. It was his need to be seen. He wasn't just killing. He was performing. Every bullet, every letter, every word, part of a show for the entire nation. And Lake Herman Road was just the opening act. Because soon the Zodiac would give himself a name. And his voice would echo far beyond California. By the summer of 1969, California was changing. The peace and love dream of the 1960s was beginning to fade, replaced by something darker, a growing sense of paranoia. Murders, protests, and war filled the headlines. But none of it prepared people for the letter that would change everything. Because this time, the killer didn't just take lives. He sent a message. It was August 1, 1969, when 3 California newspapers, the Vallejo Times-Herald, the San Francisco Chronicle, and the San Francisco Examiner, each received an envelope. No return address, no name. Only a small, circular symbol in the corner, a cross within a circle. The letters inside were identical, written in the same neat, deliberate handwriting. The tone was confident, taunting, and disturbingly calm. Each letter began with the same words. "This is the Zodiac speaking." For the first time, the killer had given himself a name. And along with his words came something even stranger, a cipher made up of 408 symbols, strange geometric shapes, and letters that made no sense. The message came with a demand. "I want you to print this cipher on the front page of your newspaper. If you do not do this, I will go on a killing rampage Friday night. I will cruise around all weekend killing lone people in the night, then move on to kill again until I end up with a dozen people over the weekend." The message was both a threat and a challenge. Police were stunned. It was one thing to commit murder. It was another to turn it into a puzzle for the entire public to solve. The Zodiac was doing something no killer had done before. He was creating a game of fear. The newspapers faced a moral dilemma. If they published the cipher, They might be helping a killer get attention. If they didn't, more people could die. After long discussions with law enforcement, all three papers decided to publish it, just as the killer demanded. And the next morning, California woke up to something never seen before. Hundreds of cryptic symbols spread across the front page of their morning paper. Some people laughed it off. Others locked their doors. But for one couple, those strange symbols became an obsession. In Salinas, California, a high school teacher named Donald Hardin and his wife Betty decided to take a closer look. They were both lovers of puzzles, intelligent, methodical, and patient. For days, they sat at their kitchen table trying to make sense of the killer's code. They looked for patterns, repeated symbols, and possible English letter frequencies. It wasn't easy. The Zodiac cipher wasn't random. It was designed to mislead, to twist logic, and to keep the solver guessing. But the Hardins refused to give up. Then, one night, they noticed something. The letter E, the most common in English, appeared frequently, often next to double symbols. They also realized that the killer might be starting his message with something personal. They tried substituting words like I, kill, and people, and slowly the pieces started to fall into place. After 20 hours of decoding, the message revealed itself, and what they read chilled them to the core. I like killing people because it is so much fun. It is more fun than killing wild game in the forest because man is the most dangerous animal of all. I will not give you my name because you will try to slow down or stop my collecting of slaves for my afterlife. The message was real. The handwriting matched the killer's previous letters, and its meaning was horrifying. For police, this was confirmation of their worst fears. They weren't dealing with someone seeking revenge or justice. They were dealing with a man who enjoyed killing, who saw murder as entertainment, a personal sport. The Zodiac wasn't trying to hide, he wanted the world to see him. He wanted to become a myth. By the end of that week, the Zodiac killer was front-page news across America. He had turned his crimes into a performance, and the stage was the entire country. Every new letter became an event. Every symbol a clue, every silence a new threat. And while detectives worked tirelessly to find him, the Zodiac watched from the shadows, reading every headline, laughing at every failure. He had the police chasing ghosts. He had the people trapped in fear. And now he had a name that would never be forgotten. But beneath the hysteria and mystery, one question haunted everyone. How could someone so intelligent, so patient, and so cruel remain invisible? The Zodiac didn't just commit murders. He engineered terror. Each cipher, each killing was part of a game, one he believed he could never lose. And as the summer of 1969 faded, California was about to learn just how far the Zodiac would go to keep his promise, because for him, the hunt was never over. It was only getting started. By the fall of 1969, the Zodiac was no longer just a killer, he was a phenomenon. His letters dominated every newspaper. His symbol, the circle with a cross through it, had become a mark of terror. Parents whispered about him in grocery stores. Teenagers told stories about him at night. And the people of San Francisco, once a city of light and peace, now lived under a shadow. Because this wasn't just about murder anymore. It was about fear, raw, consuming, and everywhere. Each new letter from the Zodiac felt like another earthquake. He wrote directly to the police, to reporters, even to the public, taunting them all. School children make nice targets. I think I shall wipe out a school bus some morning. Just shoot out the front tire and pick off the kiddies as they come bouncing out. That single paragraph changed everything. Parents stopped sending their children to school. Police cars began escorting buses every morning. Helicopters hovered over playgrounds. The killer hadn't even fired a shot, yet he had managed to freeze an entire city. That was the power of the Zodiac. He didn't just take lives. He controlled millions of minds. Meanwhile, detectives from multiple counties were working around the clock. The Vallejo Police, Napa County Sheriff's Office, and San Francisco Police Department All had open cases linked to the same man. But cooperation wasn't easy. Each department had its own procedures, its own egos, its own theories. The Zodiac seemed to know that, and he used it against them. He sent different letters to different newspapers. He referenced local landmarks. He spoke just enough truth to keep them guessing, and just enough lies to send them chasing shadows. The police were chasing a ghost. But behind the fear, something else was happening. The Zodiac was becoming a celebrity. Radio stations debated his motives. Talk shows speculated about his identity. Ordinary people wrote letters claiming to know him, love him, or even be him. For the first time in modern America, a murderer had turned into a media star. The line between news and spectacle began to blur. Every time his cipher was published, more people got involved. Amateur sleuths, puzzle enthusiasts, even housewives, all trying to decode the killer's next message. It was as if the entire state had become part of his game. And he was always one step ahead. In October 1969, the Zodiac struck again. This time, in the heart of San Francisco. October 11th, 9:55 p.m. A cab driver named Paul Stine picked up a fare near Union Square. The man asked to be taken to Presidio Heights, a quiet residential area. The next thing they saw was a man calmly wiping down the cab with a cloth, removing fingerprints. He tore off a piece of the driver's shirt, then walked away unhurried into the night. By the time police arrived, Paul Stine was dead, shot once in the head. It seemed like a robbery at first. But then, 3 days later, the Zodiac wrote to the San Francisco Chronicle again. I am the murderer of the taxi driver. To prove this, here is a piece of his shirt, and attached was the blood-stained cloth. Proof that it was him. He wasn't lying. That murder changed everything. The Zodiac had moved from lovers' lanes to the city streets. He had crossed from the shadows into broad daylight. Now, no one felt safe. Police sketch artists created a composite image of the suspect, a white male, around 30 to 40 years old, short hair, heavy build, glasses. The drawing was printed everywhere, on TV, in newspapers, even on bus stops. But it didn't matter. The city was drowning in tips, false sightings, and mass paranoia. Every stranger looked suspicious. Every quiet man with glasses felt like the killer. Even worse, the Zodiac seemed to enjoy it. He sent more letters, mocking the sketch. I look different when I do my thing. The police shall never catch me because I am too clever for them. He taunted investigators for their incompetence, bragged about walking right past them, and even claimed that he was collecting slaves for the afterlife. To him, the murders were a game, and San Francisco was his board. The media called him the Phantom of the Bay. The police called him the most dangerous man in America. But to ordinary people, he was something worse, a reminder that evil could wear any face. At home, at work, on the bus. He could be anywhere. He could be anyone. By the end of 1969, California wasn't just afraid of the Zodiac killer. It was obsessed with him. But in the middle of this chaos, as the headlines screamed and detectives grew desperate, one question lingered like a shadow over every city street. Was he killing for pleasure or for purpose? The next chapter would offer no peace. Because the Zodiac's most disturbing act was still to come, and it would prove that his true weapon wasn't his gun, but his mind. September 27, 1969. A warm Saturday afternoon at Lake Berryessa, California. The sun shimmered over the calm water. Couples picnicked on the grassy banks. Families laughed. Children splashed near the shore. It was one of those perfect days that make the world feel innocent again. Peaceful, untouched by the chaos unfolding across the state. But peace has a strange way of hiding danger. Because somewhere near those same shores, the Zodiac was watching. 22-year-old Brian Hartnell and 20-year-old Cecilia Shepard were sitting on a blanket, enjoying the quiet. They had driven from college for a picnic by the lake, far away from city noise, headlines, and fear. But just before 6:30 p.m., Cecilia noticed a man in the distance. He was walking down the hill, slowly, deliberately. At first, she thought he was just a hiker. But then she froze. The man wasn't dressed like anyone else that day. He wore an executioner-style black hood that covered his face entirely, except for 2 eye holes. Across his chest, stitched in white, was a symbol, a circle with a cross, the Zodiac's mark. And in his hands, a gun and a coil of rope. Brian tried to stay calm. The man approached them, saying in a steady, almost polite voice that he was an escaped convict from Deer Lodge Prison in Montana. He claimed he needed their car to get to Mexico. He sounded rehearsed, like he had practiced this story a dozen times. Cecilia and Brian listened, terrified, as the man pulled out precut lengths of rope. He ordered Cecilia to tie Brian's hands first, then took the rope and tied hers. Everything about him was methodical, controlled. He wasn't nervous. He was enjoying it. Then, without warning, he pulled out a long knife and stabbed them. Over and over. Brian was stabbed 6 times, Cecilia 10. As they screamed, the killer calmly walked away, disappearing into the trees. Moments later, he reached Brian's white Volkswagen and, with a black marker, wrote something on the door. Vallejo, December 20th, 68, the 4th of July, 69, Sept 27 to 69 to 6:30 by knife. 3 dates. 3 crimes. A confession carved into metal. Cecilia, bleeding heavily, managed to stay conscious. She whispered to a fisherman nearby who called for help. When police arrived, Brian was barely alive. Cecilia was still breathing but fading fast. As paramedics worked frantically, they couldn't comprehend the cruelty of it, the calm, deliberate violence of a man who had just terrorized 2 strangers in broad daylight and then walked away as if nothing had happened. An hour later, a call came in to the Napa County Police Department. The voice on the other end was calm, monotone, and unmistakably male. "I want to report a murder. No, a double murder. They are 2 miles north of park headquarters." They were in a white Volkswagen Carmen Ghia. The voice paused for a moment. Then, chillingly, "I did it." And then the line went dead. Police traced the call to a payphone near the Napa courthouse, only a few blocks from the station. The killer had called them from their own backyard, and yet no one had seen him. Hours later, Cecilia Shepard succumbed to her wounds in the hospital. Brian Hartnell survived, the only person to come face to face with the Zodiac and live to tell the story. His testimony gave police their first real description: a man in his late 20s or early 30s, stocky build, calm voice, perhaps educated, perhaps local. But the mask changed everything. It wasn't just an accessory, it was a statement. The Zodiac wasn't hiding from justice. He was creating an image, a symbol of fear. The mask was part of his mythology now. A killer who didn't just want to murder, he wanted to perform. In the following days, newspapers published every detail. The image of the hooded killer became national news. Children were afraid to walk alone. Couples stopped driving to quiet places. And police departments across California found themselves overwhelmed with new reports, false sightings, and terrified citizens. For every real clue, there were a dozen hoaxes. For every possible suspect, there was another cipher. The Zodiac had become something bigger than a man. He had become a ghost, faceless, fearless, and omnipresent. And while the public panicked, the killer watched quietly from somewhere in the crowd, reading the stories about himself, pleased with the chaos he had created. In the aftermath of Lake Berryessa, investigators began to see a disturbing evolution. This was no longer about random victims. It was about control, spectacle, and power. The Zodiac didn't kill out of anger or impulse. He killed because it made him feel like a god, untouchable and immortal. The mask, the symbols, the letters, all part of a carefully constructed identity. An identity that was no longer just real, but legendary. By the end of September 1969, the state of California was paralyzed with fear. The Zodiac had claimed his 3rd crime scene, taunted the police again, and left behind yet another unsolved riddle. And yet, for him, this was only Act 2. The real horror was still to come. Because the Zodiac wasn't done playing his game. He was just raising the stakes. July 5, 1969. It was 12:40 a.m. when the phone rang at the Vallejo Police Department. The operator picked up, expecting another routine call, a noise complaint, maybe a drunk driver. But the voice on the other end was calm. Too calm. I want to report a double murder. If you go 1 mile east on Columbus Parkway, you will find kids in a brown car. The line went silent. The voice was emotionless, not angry, not excited, just cold, detached, and disturbingly casual. The officer froze. He knew exactly what the caller meant. It was the same MO, the same weapon, the same message, the same killer. Within minutes, patrol cars were racing toward Blue Rock Springs Park, their red lights cutting through the night. When they arrived, they found a brown Corvair parked just off the road. Inside were two young people, Darlene Ferrin, 2, and Michael Mago, 19. Both had been shot multiple times. Michael was slumped in the passenger seat, barely breathing. Darlene was motionless, covered in blood. The windows were shattered, the car door riddled with bullet holes. It was chaos, yet strangely precise. Every shot had been aimed to kill. The officers didn't know it yet, but this was the night the Zodiac killer officially announced himself to the world. Hours earlier, Darlene Ferrin had picked up her friend Michael for a late-night drive. She was cheerful, energetic, a young woman with a husband, a job, and a future. They drove around Vallejo for a while, ending up at Blue Rock Springs Park, a quiet lover's lane, dimly lit and popular with young couples. It was a warm summer night. The air smelled of eucalyptus. The city was quiet. They parked, talked, laughed. Then, around midnight, a car pulled up behind them, headlights off. Michael noticed first. The car just sat there, silent, watching. Then, suddenly it drove away. They both relaxed for a moment, but a few minutes later, the same car returned. This time, it parked just a few feet behind them. The driver stepped out, a man, tall and solid, holding a flashlight in one hand and a gun in the other. The beam of light hit Michael's face. Before he could react, the man opened fire. Bullets tore through the car windows. Glass shattered. Michael was hit in the jaw, the neck, and the leg. Darlene screamed, but the man kept shooting, reloading calmly before firing again. He didn't say a word. He didn't steal anything. He didn't even run. When the shooting stopped, he turned away, walked slowly back to his car, and drove off into the night. Minutes later, that same man called the police, confessing his crime with chilling precision. Michael Mago survived. He was rushed to the hospital, in critical condition, barely able to speak. But when he regained consciousness, he described what he remembered. The shooter was a white male, late 20s to early 30s, around 5'8", with short dark hair. He wore heavy-rimmed glasses. The description didn't stand out. It could have been anyone, but one detail did, his calmness. Michael said the man moved like a professional, confident, collected, like he had done this before. There was no rage, no passion, just procedure. As detectives processed the scene, they realized the killer had left almost nothing behind. No fingerprints, no footprints, no shell casings that could lead anywhere, but the phone call that was different. They traced it to a payphone at a gas station, just blocks away from the police department. He had been that close. The phone was still warm when officers arrived. The killer had hung up less than 5 minutes earlier. They had missed him by inches. And that was what terrified them most. Not just that he had killed again, but that he was watching. He knew their routines. He knew their streets. He knew their fear. As the investigation deepened, reporters began to see the pattern, the precision, the repetition, the taunting tone. This was no ordinary killer. This was someone who planned every move, who wanted the world to know his name. A week later, he made sure of it. On July 31, 1969, letters began arriving at the offices of 3 California newspapers. Each one began the same way. "This is the Zodiac speaking. He described the Blue Rock Springs attack in detail, proving it was him. He also included a cipher, a code made up of symbols demanding it be printed on the front page of every paper. If they didn't comply, he promised more people would die. The letters confirmed what everyone feared. The phone call wasn't just a confession, it was an introduction. The Zodiac killer wasn't trying to hide, he wanted to be seen. By August, the story had gone national. The press couldn't stop talking about him, the public couldn't stop fearing him, and the police couldn't stop missing him. Every lead went cold. Every witness saw something different. Every letter brought more confusion than clarity. But one thing was clear, the Zodiac wasn't running from justice. He was leading it, step by step, into a maze he had built himself. The call that night wasn't just a confession. It was a declaration of war. And for the next few years, the entire state of California would live in that war, between fear and fascination, between truth and myth, between a killer and a city that could never escape his voice. This is the Zodiac speaking. Those 5 words would haunt America for decades to come. By 1970, the Zodiac killer had become more than just a murderer. He was a mystery that consumed California. Police departments across the state were buried under tips, confessions, and theories. Everyone had a suspect. No one had proof. He had killed, written, mocked, and vanished. And now the question was simple yet impossible. Who was the Zodiac killer? The investigation has stretched across 5 jurisdictions, from Vallejo to San Francisco, and still there was no face, no name. Detectives built suspect lists that reached into the hundreds. Ex-lovers, military men, drifters, teachers, even police officers, all questioned, all released. But among them, one name would rise above all others. A man whose life seemed to fit the puzzle perfectly, Arthur Lee Allen. Allen was a former schoolteacher. A large man, quiet, awkward, and intelligent. He lived alone, owned guns, knives, and had a fascination with codes and ciphers. But what truly disturbed investigators was how his life seemed to mirror the Zodiac story. He had been dishonorably discharged from the Navy. He was known for violent outbursts and inappropriate behavior. And he told friends that he dreamed of killing people for fun. Then came the real twist. One of Allen's acquaintances told police that Allen had once spoken about creating his own symbol, a circle with a cross, and calling himself Zodiac. This was long before the first Zodiac letter ever appeared. Investigators were stunned. The coincidences were too strong to ignore. They raided his home in 1972. Inside they found weapons, homemade bombs, and animal remains. They even found a bloody knife in the glove compartment of his car. But there was no direct evidence, no cipher, no gun, no fingerprints linking him to the murders. And just like that, he slipped away, again. Still, Allen became the central figure in the Zodiac case. He matched the physical description: heavy build, short hair, glasses. He lived in Vallejo, near the first murders. He even had access to the same brand of typewriter used in some of the Zodiac letters. But the real break came years later, when investigators recovered a partial fingerprint from one of the Zodiac's letters and sent it for comparison. It didn't match Arthur Lee Allen. DNA testing decades later would also exclude him. Once again, the Zodiac had turned the truth into smoke. But Allen wasn't the only suspect. There were others, each with strange connections to the case. Rick Marshall, a film projectionist in San Francisco, was obsessed with puzzles and codes. He even collected reel-to-reel tapes and wrote in blocky handwriting similar to the Zodiac's. Some claimed his home contained blueprints of San Francisco's theaters, the same cityscape the Zodiac often referenced in his letters. Then came Lawrence Kane, a salesman and ex-Navy man who had suffered a brain injury years before the killings. He lived near one of the Zodiac's victims, and his appearance matched the police sketch eerily well. A retired cop swore Kane's voice sounded exactly like the one from the killer's phone call. And then there was Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, later known for his anti-technology manifesto and mail bombings. His writing style resembled the Zodiac's, cryptic, intellectual, and taunting. Some even speculated he has started his killing career as the Zodiac before turning to domestic terrorism. But that theory too lacked proof. Every suspect had a piece of the puzzle, but none had the whole picture. Meanwhile, the Zodiac himself continued to play with his hunters. He sent another letter to the San Francisco Chronicle claiming responsibility for new murders, attaching more cryptic codes and even offering clues about his identity, a twisted riddle involving his birth, month, his servant slaves, and his collection of victims for the afterlife. Every word was designed to mislead. He was feeding on the attention, watching the police chase their tails while he disappeared deeper into myth. The letters grew stranger. He bragged about shooting a man, about killing for pleasure, about mocking the police. Yet, every time detectives followed his trail, it ended in nothing. It was like trying to catch smoke. Years passed, detectives aged, files grew thicker. The public moved on. But the question remained, was the Zodiac still out there? Was he alive, living an ordinary life behind a normal face? Or had he died long ago, taking his secrets to the grave? When Arthur Lee Allen died in 1992, many believed the case was finally over. But new DNA tests would later rule him out completely, proving that, once again, the Zodiac had fooled everyone. Even in death, Allen's innocence meant one chilling thing: the real killer was still out there, and had been, perhaps, all along. Today, the Zodiac file still sits open in multiple police departments. Over 2,500 suspects have been investigated. Hundreds of people have confessed. And countless amateur sleuths continue to search for answers, decoding the same letters, chasing the same ghost. But the truth is simple and terrifying. The Zodiac didn't just vanish. He was never found. He was whoever he wanted to be: a teacher, a neighbor, a stranger passing you on the street. And as long as his identity remains a mystery, he still wins, because the Zodiac's greatest weapon wasn't his gun or his knife, it was his ability to stay unseen. By the dawn of 1970, the Zodiac Killer had done something no murderer in modern America had ever achieved. He had become famous. He wasn't a shadow in the night anymore. He was a headline, a radio broadcast, a late-night conversation. Every whisper in California seemed to begin with the same chilling question: did you hear what the Zodiac said this time? This wasn't just crime. This was theater, and the entire nation was watching. The Zodiac understood something powerful about human nature. He knew that people fear what they can't understand, and he turned that fear into his weapon. While police searched for evidence, he hunted for attention. He didn't need to hide in the darkness. He only needed a typewriter and a postage stamp. Each new letter he sent was a performance, part riddle, part threat, part confession. His handwriting became iconic, neat, deliberate, and strangely elegant. His symbol, a circle with a cross, began appearing on front pages across California. It was more than a mark of ownership, it was branding. He had turned murder into a logo. When the newspapers printed his ciphers, California became obsessed. Office workers, teachers, and teenagers sat around their kitchen tables late into the night, trying to decode the killer's secret message. What did it mean? What did he want? For days, his puzzle consumed the public, until one ordinary school teacher and his wife finally cracked it. The word spread like wildfire. For the first time, people saw not just the horror of his crimes, but the emptiness of his soul. This was a man who didn't kill for money, passion, or revenge. He killed because it amused him. And that, perhaps, was the most terrifying truth of all. The newspapers faced a terrible moral dilemma. Every time they printed his letters, they gave him what he wanted: attention. But if they refused, he threatened to kill again. The editors of the San Francisco Chronicle later admitted they felt trapped, like puppets in the killer's performance. If we printed his words, one editor said, we were feeding him. But if we didn't, and someone died, we'd never forgive ourselves. And so they kept printing. Each new letter brought a new wave of fear and fascination. The Zodiac was everywhere. He was on the front page, on the radio, in the movies. Even people who didn't live in California knew his name. But as the headlines grew, something darker began to happen. Something the killer himself might never have expected. He wasn't just feared anymore. He was famous. Reporters called him the Master of Death. Magazines published sketches of his faux face. Filmmakers discussed turning his story into a motion picture, even as his victims' families were still grieving. The Zodiac had crossed the line from killer to celebrity, and America, captivated by fear, became his audience. He had mastered the art of media manipulation. Psychologists later said the Zodiac was one of the first criminals to truly understand the power of narrative. He knew that people don't remember victims, they remember villains. Each new murder, each new cipher, was part of a story, one that he wrote and everyone else followed. Even his mistakes became myth. Every shadowy sighting, every anonymous phone call, every rumor added another layer to his legend. And while the police were struggling to connect the dots, the Zodiac was already several moves ahead, building a story that would outlive every one of them. The irony was brutal. The very tools designed to expose him, the newspapers, the radio, the nightly news, became the very instruments that protected him. The more people talked about him, the more powerful he became. Every headline fed his ego. Every theory deepened the mystery. Even the investigators couldn't escape his influence. Some officers admitted years later that they would rush to the newsstand before clocking in, just to see what the Zodiac had written overnight. The police were chasing not just a man, but a myth. By the end of 1970, his grip on California wasn't through violence, it was through imagination. He didn't need to kill anymore. He just needed to write. He had learned that the human mind could be terrorized far more effectively than the human body. His legacy wasn't just in the victims he left behind. It was in the fear that spread across an entire nation. And that fear, once created, never really went away. Because the Zodiac had discovered something that would change crime and media forever. If you control the story, you never have to show your face. By 1971, California had changed. The fear that once consumed every street, every newspaper, every quiet conversation was beginning to fade, not because the Zodiac killer had been caught, but because he had simply vanished. No more letters. No more murders. No more taunting calls to the police. Just silence. And that silence was the most terrifying thing of all. For nearly 3 years, the Zodiac had dominated headlines, haunting the state like a ghost who could write. He had taunted detectives, mocked reporters, and made ordinary people feel unsafe in their own homes. Then, suddenly, nothing. The phone stopped ringing. The letters stopped coming. The trail went cold. Investigators were left staring at a wall of unanswered questions. Who was he? Why did he stop? Was he dead? Or worse, still out there, watching? Dozens of police departments continued to work on the case, each holding pieces of a puzzle that refused to fit together. Hundreds of suspects had been investigated, men with strange pasts, violent tempers, secret lives. But every time detectives thought they had found him, the evidence slipped through their fingers like smoke. The most promising lead remained Arthur Lee Allen, the ex-school teacher from Vallejo. Everything about him seemed wrong, and therefore right. He had been near the scene of the early killings. He was obsessed with cryptography. He wore the same style of boots that left prints at one of the crime scenes. He even told a friend that he planned to call himself Zodiac years before the letters appeared. Detectives searched his house twice. They found weapons, strange tapes, and a watch engraved with the Zodiac symbol. But no matter how close they got, the smoking gun never appeared. The handwriting didn't match perfectly, the fingerprints weren't conclusive. And there was no DNA evidence, not yet. The case became a battle between logic and faith. The police were sure they had their man, but the evidence refused to cooperate. By the mid-1970s, new killings began surfacing across California. Some bore similarities to the Zodiac murders, same caliber bullets, same cryptic symbols. Each time the press reignited the panic, is the Zodiac back? But none of those murders were ever conclusively linked to him. And as time went on, the leads grew colder, the witnesses older, and the memories fainter. Even the detectives who had once lived and breathed the Zodiac began to move on. But one thing haunted them, the possibility that the killer hadn't stopped because he was dead. Maybe he had just grown bored. After all, this was a man who killed for attention. What if he had found a new way to entertain himself? Then, in 1974, something strange happened. A letter arrived at the San Francisco Chronicle. It was short, polite, almost. The handwriting was familiar, the tone unmistakable. This is the Zodiac speaking. I am now in control of all things. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't even a threat. It was a statement, cold, arrogant, and final. After that, the letters truly stopped. For nearly 2 decades, the Zodiac faded from public view, like a ghost dissolving into the fog. But the mystery remained. Detectives refused to close the file. New generations of investigators picked up the case, using newer tools, better technology, and sharper analysis. In the 1990s, as DNA testing became more advanced, evidence from old letters and envelopes was re-examined. For the first time, there was hope, real scientific hope, that the Zodiac's identity could finally be revealed. And then, disappointment. The samples were too degraded, too contaminated to produce a clear match. Once again, the killer had escaped justice, not through brilliance, but through time. By the 2000s, the Zodiac case had become the holy grail of true crime. Detectives, journalists, cryptographers, and amateur sleuths around the world joined the hunt. Online forums sprang up, each filled with theories, some wild, some convincing. Names were thrown around recklessly, from politicians to Hollywood producers to random strangers. Everyone wanted to solve it. Everyone wanted to be the one who uncovered the face behind the symbol. And in that obsession, the Zodiac achieved exactly what he had always wanted: immortality. In 2004, the San Francisco Police Department officially closed the case, citing a lack of new evidence. But not everyone agreed. Retired detectives continued digging, convinced that somewhere in the yellowed papers of police archives lay the clue that had been missed. Then, in 2020, a breakthrough, at least a partial one. A team of private cryptographers finally cracked one of the Zodiac's unsolved ciphers, the infamous 340 code. Hidden in its twisted pattern of letters and symbols was another message from the killer himself. I hope you are having lots of fun in trying to catch me. I am not afraid because I will never be caught. Even decades later, his voice still echoed, smug, untouchable, defiant. Today, the case remains open. New suspects have emerged. DNA results continue to be tested. But the truth, the real truth, still lies somewhere between evidence and myth. And maybe that's exactly what the Zodiac wanted all along. He didn't just want to kill. He wanted to outlive everyone. He wanted to prove that fear lasts longer than life, and silence is the perfect disguise. The trail has gone cold. But the story never did. Because in the quiet corners of California, when the fog rolls in and the headlines fade, there are still people who remember. And they still whisper the same words, the ones that began it all. This is the Zodiac speaking. It's been more than 50 years. Half a century since the Zodiac killer's first attack. And yet, his shadow still lingers. Not on the streets of California anymore, but in its memory, etched deep into the country's cultural psyche like a scar that refuses to fade. The Zodiac wasn't just a killer. He was a story that America could never stop telling. And maybe that's exactly what he wanted. The world has changed since those nights of terror in the late 1960s. Technology has evolved. DNA evidence has revolutionized investigations. We can trace a person's life through a single strand of hair or a touch on an envelope. But somehow, he remains untraceable. Every few years, someone claims to have found him, a new suspect, a new theory, a new documentary. Each time, it feels like the case might finally be closing, and each time it slips away again. The Zodiac was more than a man, he was a ghost born from fear, and ghosts don't die. They fade, only to return when the world starts to forget. In many ways, his crimes became a turning point, not just in criminal history, but in how society began to consume fear. Before the Zodiac, killers hid from attention. He taught a generation of criminals that you didn't need to kill the most, you just needed to make people remember you. Every headline, every cipher, every chilling letter was carefully designed to control the public narrative. He didn't just want to kill people, he wanted to own their thoughts. And for decades, he succeeded. Even today, when people talk about serial killers, one name always stands apart, not because of the body count, but because of the mystery. Jack the Ripper terrified London in the 1880s, but the Zodiac terrified the modern world. He made an entire city question its safety, its institutions, even its sanity. He made ordinary people look at their neighbors differently, wondering if evil could really hide behind such ordinary faces. That was his greatest power, the ability to make people doubt each other. And yet, amid all the fear, there was also a strange kind of fascination. People studied his letters like poetry. His ciphers became puzzles that drew thousands into their cryptic beauty. He was a killer who had become a riddle, one that everyone wanted to solve. But behind that fascination was something deeply human, our obsession with understanding evil. Because if we could understand it, if we could explain it, then maybe we could control it. But the Zodiac was a reminder that some things can't be explained. Some evils don't have logic, they just exist. In recent years, new forensic breakthroughs have reignited the investigation. Private labs have been testing saliva traces from Zodiac's letters. Amateur sleuths using artificial intelligence have matched handwriting samples. Even retired detectives who once chased him have come back to the case, driven not by duty, but by obsession. And every new discovery brings the same question. What if we finally find him? What if the Zodiac is identified, not as a monster, but as an old man living quietly somewhere, unknown, unseen, unpunished? Would that bring justice? Would that bring peace? Or would it only deepen the wound, the realization that evil doesn't always wear a mask? The truth is, the Zodiac's greatest victory wasn't his ability to evade capture. It was his ability to be remembered. Even now, his symbol, the crosshair circle, appears on t-shirts, tattoos, podcasts, documentaries. It's become a part of popular culture, a dark brand stamped into history. And every time someone tries to decode his ciphers, or write about him, or speak his name, they give him exactly what he wanted, immortality. Because while his victims' names have faded from memory, his name still echoes through time, a reminder that some stories never end. But perhaps the real story isn't about him at all. It's about what he exposed in us, our fear, our curiosity, our strange attraction to the darkness. The Zodiac Killer forced society to confront the uncomfortable truth that evil doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes, it looks like a man in a clean shirt, with neat handwriting and a calm voice on the telephone. And that's what makes him unforgettable. Today, the Zodiac's letters rest in archives, yellowed, fragile, and silent. But if you look closely, they still carry his voice, still mocking, still taunting, still daring us to find him. Maybe one day we will. Maybe one day his name will finally be spoken aloud in a courtroom, his crimes laid bare before the world. But even then, it won't end his story. Because the Zodiac was never just one man. He was a mirror, reflecting the fear that hides inside all of us, the fear of the unknown, the fear of what people are capable of, the fear that the real monster might be human. The Zodiac Killer may have disappeared, but his shadow never did. It lives on, in our stories, in our nightmares, and in the eternal question that will haunt generations to come. who was the Zodiac killer, and perhaps that's exactly how he wanted it to end.